Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Hard Count podcast. And today, we're switching it up a little bit. I know I usually don't do fantasy football, but these next couple of videos, I'm thinking about doing some fantasy football rankings, and we're going to start here with quarterbacks. Let me know if you like these fantasy videos, maybe not so much. But yeah, let's try it out here with my fantasy quarterbacks. I love fantasy football, so let's get right into it. Number 10, we've got Drew Brees, first guy on the list. And he's one of my favorite guys to pick up. I often find myself ending up with Drew Brees at the end of mock drafts that I do because he's one of my favorite later round quarterbacks. And I think that's because I know what I'm getting with Brees, a guy who can consistently put up 20 points. There's not as much upside with Brees, which is a reason that he's not up higher on this list, really. But I think I really like the consistency in Brees' game. And, Brees' value is projected to decline. It's declined in the public view this year. But I believe his elite passing, his statistics in that category will keep him pretty viable quarterback for fantasy players this year. His ADP right now is currently hovering around 120. And I think that's because, again, of the fantasy owners' fear of his decline. But statistically, I don't see any sign of this decline. We haven't seen over the past couple of years. I don't have a reason to believe that it's going to happen this year. He's still got the same offensive line, still got the great weapons. They added Emmanuel Sanders, still has Alvin Kamara. I just don't really see a reason to expect a decline. Obviously, he's getting older, but I just don't see it. And I think his ADP is a little bit low given what he offers in the passing game, his consistency, his football IQ, which I think will keep him up there with the best quarterbacks. And a healthy Drew Brees, I think, has one of the highest floors of any player in the league. And I do expect him to stay healthy. So, consistency, again, something that I've always favored in my leagues because quarterbacks are rarely what makes the difference in winning a game. Obviously, you get a Lamar Jackson or you get a guy who puts up 40 points one week, and that's huge. But usually it's the running backs and the wide receivers, and a guy that guarantees you 20 points that you picked up later in the rounds can really allow those running backs, receivers that you took earlier in the earlier rounds to swing the needle in games. And yeah, so definitely Brees, one of my favorite mid-late round pickups at the quarterback position. So definitely a guy to consider there. So number 9, we've got Tom Brady. First time we've seen him out of New England ever. So very interesting here for me, and I think it definitely boosts up his fantasy ranking, his potential there. And I think Brady, really high ceiling this year for fantasy. I think that it is because we saw New England really, really limiting what Brady could do fantasy-wise, and I think that's the opposite here in Tampa Bay. Last time we saw Brady with a combination of receivers like Evans, Godwin was 2007, where Brady threw for 50 touchdowns. And I'm not saying it's going to happen again, but, I could definitely see him reaching 35 touchdowns, 30, which is huge for fantasy. And he's also with Bruce Arians, who, as Brady said, is the first offensive coach he's had in his entire career. So I'm very excited to watch that. Winston, last year, underratedly good fantasy option because of how much he passed. And I think that's going to stay the same in Tampa Bay. They're going to be pass happy all the time. And that's really, really helping Brady's floor as well. So, the one thing Brady is missing is that rushing attack, which really, really helps fantasy quarterbacks. 7 out of the 10 top 10 quarterbacks last year were all, rushing dual threat quarterbacks. So Brady doesn't have that. But just the sheer amount of pass attempts he's going to get with the elite weapons around him and a great offensive coach, Bruce Arians, is enough for me to put him at 9. At 8, we have Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan, one of my favorite, again, same with Drew Brees, one of my favorite later round quarterbacks to pick up. I think he has the potential to be a top 5 guy this year. And I think there's a lot to like about Matt Ryan, part of Atlanta. That Atlanta offense, which is one of the most pass-happy offenses in the league. I really do expect Atlanta to progress this season in terms of offensive line play, which did struggle a little bit last year, but they've got some younger guys that I expect to progress. And the last time that Matt Ryan had good protection was the 2016 season, where he put up really solid MVP numbers. So I think that you could even make the case that this Atlanta offense could be even better We've got solid blocking for Ryan, Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley. Added Hayden Hurst, who I think will play a similar role as Austin Hooper, and I think he could definitely take a big step. Got Todd Gurley, who I think will come back a little bit this year. I'm not expecting what we saw a couple years ago, and the Rams, but I do expect him to be a valid weapon. So there's just a lot of threat on this offense. Very pass happy, favors Matt Ryan in that way, because Matt Ryan isn't a guy that's going to get a ton of rush yards, which does bump down his floor a little bit, because he won't have those 40 rush yards a game to really keep it up there. So, but I think, Matt Ryan overall, because of those weapons, how much he's going to be passing, is definitely going to be, again, top 5 potential and a pretty solid pickup. So, and if he's available, definitely pick him up in those mid-later rounds of your draft. All right, number 7, we've got Josh Allen, our first dual threat quarterback on here. And the reason for that, I think when I'm looking at a fantasy quarterback, I'm looking for a guy who can consistently put up fantasy points. And I like knowing what I'm going to get week to week, especially if I'm investing a higher round pick in a guy like Josh Allen. And I think Josh Allen does not exactly fit that prototype for me in terms of a guy who can consistently put up numbers every week. And yes, I know he has a pretty high floor due to the fact that he runs quite frequently, one of the best rushing quarterbacks in the league. And again, rushing quarterbacks are very valuable in fantasy. Everyone should know that by now, and I'll keep emphasizing it. But Josh Allen has really been put in a position to succeed this year, and I do expect a good season from Allen. That's why he's here at 7. And, I think, yes, they added Diggs, reliable pass catcher, good thing for Allen's passing numbers and the offense as a whole, I think. But I think one thing that it's telling me that is a little concerning is maybe that the Bills are going to try and pass the ball a little bit more, not give Allen the opportunity to run as much, which is not so great as if you're a fantasy owner. It's not the end of the world because he'll still get those passing numbers up, but rushing obviously more valuable than passing in fantasy. So that is one concern for me. And then also, the Bills have a much, much tougher schedule this year in terms of defenses played than last year. And last year, Allen's fantasy performance definitely saw a drop-off in the games he played against New England, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Philly. We saw, his average ranging in 13, 14 points in those games, which is much less than what we saw against the easier defenses. And he's still going to have some of those games where he's playing those easier defenses. But more games against those more difficult defenses. We did, and I'm not expecting it to be too much of a concern, but it's just something to look out for. And that's one of the reasons that I've got Allen below some of the guys above him, because there's a little more concern there. But even though I just talked negative about Josh Allen, again, a lot of upside. Bills offense, which is built for him to be successful. We know how valuable his rushing is at the quarterback position. So yeah, if Allen drops a little bit from his ADP, falls to you maybe in the 9th round, you got another guy that you can back him up with that's pretty solid. I like picking Josh Allen in the 9th round, but other than that, I would stay away from him if he's earlier up there, because I think there's a little too much risk, but I still think he's one of the better fantasy quarterbacks, so I've got to put him here at 7. So at number 6, we've got Deshaun Watson. And I'm a little torn on where I'm thinking about putting Watson. I know I'm a little bit lower on Watson than some other people. I know I've seen some people have him at 4, 5, even 3. I just don't see that right now. I think there's a little more risk involved in taking Watson. Same thing with Josh Allen. I'm talking about than the other guys that are going to be above him, that are in the same range of ADPs. And I think really for me, because what depends on how Watson performs in fantasy depends on a lot of things, like how they run the offense, who can stay healthy around him. And I think that's not what I'm willing to bet on. And I think best case scenario for Watson, Will Fuller stays healthy and the Texans really rely on Watson in a pass-heavy offense, which I'm not fully expecting, because Will Fuller has not stayed healthy, and the last season the Texans were one of the more run-heavy offenses in the league. So I think there's too much out of, Watson's control in terms of fantasy that I'm not willing to bet on. But he definitely has a lot of upside. Again, Brandon Cooks adds a lot of speed to that offense is an underrated addition because now you got Will Fuller, Brandon Cooks, who both are very good deep threats on the outside and definitely plays to Watson's strengths a little bit more. So I think with both Cooks and Fuller healthy, we could see a fairly elite deep passing game, and that would be very good for Watson's fantasy production. We also see Watson, again, a dual threat quarterback. He scrambles on the third most percentage of his snaps, which is good for you if you want him in fantasy because he does have that floor because of his rushing ability. But again, I really like Watson in terms of his ceiling, but there's too much out of what we know right now, how things are going to be run, who's going to get injured, who's going to be healthy, for me to really bet on him above the guys that I have a couple spots ahead we're going to get to in a moment. But, I just wouldn't take him because he's going in the same range as those guys. All right, now we've got number 5, Russell Wilson. Don't have too much to say about him. Next guy on the list. He is a very reliable bet at quarterback this season. I really like that. Wilson's one of the only dual threat guys that I'm very confident is going to have a good season. I don't think his upside is tremendous like some of the other guys that are above him that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but he's been a top 12 quarterback in each of his 8 seasons while finishing top 3 in 4 of them. So again, very good consistency there. And that's why I've got him here. Partly Wilson surrounded by many pieces in the passing game that are going to be really helpful. And I believe that the Seahawks, they're going to play more pass heavy this season. We know the Seahawks are notorious for starting out the game run heavy, getting to the fourth quarter, then relying on Russell Wilson. I think we're going to see a little bit more pass heavy offense throughout the entire game, considering the weapons they have, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett. That's leading me to believe, again, that they're going to pass a little more. And I don't have to say too much about Wilson, but if you pick him up in the right spot, he's definitely a great, reliable addition to your team. And I really think Wilson could be a very solid pickup this year. And at number 4, we have Kyler Murray. And he is last year's Rookie of the Year, played in a very great season as well. And Kyler, loaded with upside, has a great chance to be an elite fantasy quarterback. I could even see him finishing maybe as quarterback 3, 2, 1 even, if everything goes his way. Murray, of course, last season, as I said, 7 of the top 10 fantasy quarterbacks were dual threat quarterbacks, including Murray. Finished 8th last year in fantasy. And I think this was with a mediocre group of receivers and uncertainty at running back. And then this season, you add an elite pass catcher, DeAndre Hopkins, my second best receiver in the league, instantly significantly upgrades Murray's weapons and the passing game in Arizona, and much more stability at back with Kenyon Drake, who's added to the mix. And I think, again, you've got a reliable guy there at running back, which you didn't really have last year. We had a bunch of guys bouncing in and out of there. But I think one thing is people overrate the amount of times he's going to run, because he's probably the second most athletic quarterback in the league. Some would say first. But Cliff Kingsbury and that offense don't really utilize Kyler's rushing as much as, the Ravens do with Lamar. And I think that's why I don't have him as high, because most of his rushing yards come from scrambles, while Lamar's come from design runs, scrambles. So you can rely on those rushing yards. Every week I'm not relying on those rushing yards from Kyler Murray because we don't really know. One week he could have 100, one week he could have 10. So that's why I don't think he's up there quite as much. But I think the only thing I could see going wrong with Kyler is the fact that the offensive line really didn't improve much from last season. Bottom 10 last season in terms of offensive line play. But that's really about it, because he's got a very high ceiling and a pretty high floor as well because of his rushing ability. But if Kyler falls to the 5th, 6th round of your drafts, definitely a guy to consider picking up. Definitely could be last year's Lamar Jackson. Definitely could be one of those rare instances where the quarterback position really swings your team from win or lose consistently throughout the entire year. So again, 5th or 6th round, I would definitely consider picking him up. Very high ceiling because the offense he's in is very well set up for Kyler to succeed. All right. Number 3, we got into our top 3 here. We've got Dak Prescott. Love him or hate him, Dak Prescott here at 3. And I think, again, as we were saying with Kyler Murray, Dak Prescott, one of the only guys other than the top 2 guys we're going to get to in a second, that has a potential to finish as quarterback 1 in my eyes. And Dak has an offense that is going to be built for him and his fantasy success. New head coach Mike McCarthy has always been a pretty pass-happy coach. We saw in Green Bay, Aaron Rodgers had elite fantasy production, some of the better fantasy seasons we've seen in a very long time. And yes, that was prime Aaron Rodgers, and I'm not saying Dak is like prime Aaron Rodgers, because he's definitely not. But Aaron Rodgers was given the opportunity, and that translated into fantasy success. So I'm expecting to see some similarities here in Dallas. We've got some amazing threats in the passing game. Mari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup. And I think there will always be someone open for him to throw to. Last year, Cowboys offense first in total offense, second in passing yards per game. And, I like Dak a lot as well. He will be able to use his mobility. He's not the most mobile guy, but he will get you some rushing yards every game. And they use his mobility a lot in the red zone, so he will be getting a lot of those rushing touchdowns, more than some other guys in the league. And I don't really see how Dak Prescott could go wrong in fantasy this season. If he drops you in the right spot, I would definitely feel good about taking Dak, even though I don't really promote, again, those early round quarterbacks. But Dak is definitely a solid option to the amount of production he can get and the amazing talent around him. All right, at number 2, we've got Lamar Jackson. This was very tough between 1 and 2, and I really don't think you can go wrong with either of these guys. But again, these are the top 2 for sure. They're the guys you're going to have to spend an early, second round pick on for these guys, which I'm not a big fan of. But I think Lamar Jackson, again, we know last season, one of those performances by a quarterback that is very rare, completely changes up your team. Having Lamar last season won you many, many, many games. So that I'm not expecting that to happen again, but I do see the upside here with Lamar. Again, he has the potential to repeat last season. I'm not predicting it, or he'd definitely be one on this list. I expect some regression fantasy-wise from Lamar. I expect the Ravens to come out a little bit, out of the gate. I expect them to throw the ball a little bit more, which is not really the best for Lamar fantasy-wise. You want to see him rushing as much as possible. And they also added J.K. Dobbins to that backfield, which not only tells me that they want to give Mark Ingram a very solid backup, which I think is a great thing, but it's also a little bit concerning for Lamar fantasy-wise, because it also tells me that they maybe want to be taking off some of that rushing load from Lamar Jackson, bringing another back that can take some of that rushing load on and, give Lamar a little bit less carries, which is not the best for Lamar's fantasy, again. So, again, those are my 2 concerns. That's what really separated number 2 and number 1 for me. But I think there's not much to dislike about Lamar. Very high floor, some of the highest upside in the league. Got some playmakers around him, Hollywood Brown, great coaching staff. And, in a minute, I'll explain one more reason that I don't have Lamar at 1 when I get to my number 1 guy. But I think Lamar Jackson is the perfect position to succeed with the Ravens. I wouldn't draft him at his current ADP because I'm not a big fan of the early round quarterbacks. But I definitely expect Lamar to have a great season. And if he falls to you, maybe a round later than his ADP, I'd definitely pick him up because he could be another game-changing kind of guy. But at number 1, we have Patrick Mahomes, number 1 fantasy quarterback in the NFL for me. I think, again, for me, picking up a quarterback early in the draft, which I am not a huge fan of, but if I were to do so, it would definitely be Patrick Mahomes. I think Mahomes, incredible upside. I could see another 50 touchdown season from him any day. And we saw a little bit of touchdown regression from Mahomes last year, but I think we're going to see a little bit of a reboot season from Mahomes. He has it all in terms of what you want in a fantasy quarterback. He can do all things well on the field, surrounded by elite talent, his elite play callers. pretty good rushing ability as well. We don't see it too much, but definitely elevates his floor. And I think one of the other reasons that I have Mahomes at 1 over Lamar, again, because I think Mahomes will, give you some more night in, night out, consistent elite fantasy performances. Because even on a bad night, Mahomes will throw for 250 yards and a couple touchdowns, and that's still a very good fantasy performance, while Lamar on a bad night would really not put up a good fantasy performance at all and really could lose you the game in that regard. But again, I don't recommend drafting this guy in the second round because quarterbacks do not push your team over the edge as frequently as, say, a running back or a wide receiver do. But if a guy like Mahomes drops you in the mid-third, I would say it's not a bad pick at all. I mean, do I really have to explain too much here? Again, Mahomes, Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, Mecole Hardman, throwing it like 50 times a game, D-play after D-play. That's why I have Mahomes at number 1. And yeah, those are my top 10 fantasy quarterbacks. Thank you guys so much for listening. I hope it helped. And yeah, peace.